Fire is often associated with transformation, change, and power. Culturally, we say things like adding fuel to the fire, playing with fire, or being on fire for something. Join us in person or online for Meck's 5-week series on fire as we dive deeper into Elijah's life to discover how we can implement the same transformative change in our own lives.
Well, everybody, welcome to Meck's online campus. There was a famous study which came from the University of Washington several years ago, which tried to get a handle on our emotional limits by talking in terms of what they called life change units. It was called the Life Change Index Scale or stress test. You may have heard of it. Let me give you a taste for how it worked. Let me give you the top 10 life change events in terms of our emotional lives and the impact they have on us in terms of stress. So, the top of the list, probably not surprising, the death of a spouse with an impact score of 200. Nothing came in higher. That's followed by divorce at 73, marital separation at 65. So already we see that the top three were all related in one way or another to marriage. Next came, and we'll just kind of throw all these up there at one time, next came the death of a close family member, a jail term, personal injury or illness, getting married, getting fired from work, a marital reconciliation, and then rounding out the top 10, retirement. So looking at that list, let's just say that in a single year, you got divorced, had a parent die, got a severe case of, say, COVID and needed hospitalization, and then you were fired from work. That would add up to an impact score of 236. Not a good year. And that puts you at great risk because the study concluded that no one could stand more than 300 life change units in a 12-month period without suffering from a severe physical or emotional breakdown within the next 2 years. Okay, hold that thought. We've been in a series on the life of a man who, in every sense of the word, was just on fire. He was a physical, spiritual stud. Here's a recap of what we've learned so far. God empowered him to call for rain to end for 3 years and then for that rain to start up again simply by voicing the words. During a famine, he touched a jar of flour and miraculously that jar never went empty. He touched a jug of oil, same thing, never went dry. He even raised a young boy from the dead, one of the few people God ever used to raise someone from the dead other than Jesus. But the climax of it all for this man, whose name was Elijah, came at a place called Mount Carmel. There, Elijah went head to head with not one, not two, but 450 prophets of the false god and idol the people had created and named Baal. Here's what happened. Elijah, prompted by God, went to the king of the land and essentially said, you have really fallen spiritually. I mean, you're in a free fall and you've led this whole nation into darkness. You've come to think that this Baal is God. And of course, I say that the Lord is God. So let's settle it in your heart. Let's settle it in the people's heart. You as king can get everybody in Israel together. So get them all together and let's do this. Let's meet on Mount Carmel and then we'll have a contest. We'll have a challenge. We'll get 2 bulls and cut them up for sacrifice, but we won't burn them ourselves. We'll each pray to our respective God to do the burning for us, even though there's 450 of your prophets praying and only one of me. And the king said, game on. The prophets of Baal went first. They called on their God from morning to noon. Nothing happened. Then they danced around the altar and nothing happened. They shouted and screamed and cried, Baal, answer us. Nothing happened. Elijah began to taunt them and mock them and even saying things like, well, yell louder. Maybe your God had to go to the bathroom or something. He really said that. For hours and hours they went on until they had exhausted themselves to no avail. Then it was Elijah's turn. And he went up to the altar of the one true God that had fallen into disrepair because the people had abandoned it. And so he repaired it. Then he arranged the wood and the bull upon it. And then he took water and he poured water all over the wood to make sure it was soaked. And he soaked it 3 different times so that no one could accuse him of any kind of trickery or deceit. Then he called the people around him and offered a simple prayer asking God to show himself as God. And then this happened. Immediately, the fire of the Lord flashed down from heaven and burned up the young bull, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and even licked up all the water in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell face down on the ground and cried out, "The Lord, he is God. Yes, the Lord is God." Then the people seized the prophets of Baal and killed them. And before the king could do anything to Elijah in response, God miraculously supplied Elijah with the strength and speed to escape to another city. All in all, not a bad day for a prophet. But what happened then? Well, as you would imagine, the king was none too pleased as how that day went. Neither was his wife, and she was the real power in the kingdom. She was the real source of evil. The king's name was Ahab, but it's his wife's name you may have heard. The queen was named Jezebel. Yes, the Jezebel, the one whose name is used as a euphemism for evil and treachery and deceit to this day. She sent a simple message to Elijah: "You are a dead man." Now, you'd think that after all that God had done in and through him, the power and faithfulness he had shown, Jezebel's threat would have meant absolutely nothing to Elijah. But it did mean something to him. And for one simple reason: the man was wasted. The entire run to that point had left Elijah emotionally spent, spiritually exhausted. He had run as hard as he could, and he just couldn't run anymore. His life and his work, his ministry and his effort, his responsibility and his duties, his deadlines and his demands had left him completely tapped out. There had been one too many life change units. So this is how he responded. Elijah was afraid and fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. Then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life." Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. Have you ever felt, and I know you have, emotionally spent? Just drained and wiped out and empty and just nothing left in the tanks? I remember several years ago when I was feeling this way and wondered if I was the only one who ever had felt that way, because sometimes you feel kind of alone with it all. I remember running across two news articles that came out the same week. The first was a cover story by Newsweek on the man who was then president of Harvard University, a guy by the name of Neil Rudenstein. The cover showed his picture with a single word underneath it: exhausted. Inside, there was a lengthy article titled "Breaking Point" that detailed how he hit the wall through a life filled with tasks and deadlines and quotas and engagements. He collapsed under the weight of it all and was forced into a 3-month sabbatical by his physician. The second article, as I mentioned, came out a little later. It was an article on Mike Krzyzewski and how he had left his position as head of the Duke basketball team. I don't know if you remember when he did that, how he left for a season but then came back. He pointed to a bulging disc in his back, but the article was generated by an ESPN interview where he confessed it was really more about a bulging life. He looked around, he said, and the daughter he thought was 8 was now 12. His marriage was suffering. His life had become so saturated with activity to the point that it just began to fall apart. A lot of us have experienced that. All of life pushed to the limit. We're racing here, we're pushing it there, we're extending ourselves somewhere else. We run the race as hard as we can, but then we reach a point where we just can't run it anymore. We max out, we hit the wall, and we burn out. Even when it's good things. It can be job promotions and a company expanding, a new baby, a new marriage. You can still get depleted. That's what happened to Elijah. And when it comes, it's not pretty. Here's what happens with emotional depletion, and observing these marks is certainly not original with me. The first thing you do when this part of you is drained is you start skimming. Skimming is when you begin to economize in key areas of your life in order to keep all of your balls in the air. You begin to skim relationally, like with a marriage that becomes more and more superficial. You respond by putting Band-Aids on major wounds, looking for quick fixes. You come home at the end of the day hoping there are no problems because you just don't have the time or the energy to deal with it. Intimacy becomes a thing of the past and eventually dies. You start skimming with your kids. You're just not close anymore. I mean, you see a little problem going on with them or one of them, and they start to veer off course. You see a red flag in their behavior, but you look the other way because you just don't have the energy to deal with it. You start to skim emotionally. You don't pay attention to hurt, anger, guilt, or sadness. You just start stuffing things and marching on and doing your duty. And you skim spiritually. Prayer is reduced to cries of help. Worship, if that was a part of your life, is reduced to just thanking God for seeing you through another day without everything crashing around you. All of this leads to a diminished capacity to love and to show compassion or even foundational empathy toward other people. When you're empty and spent, you can't feel compassion toward people because you don't have the emotional energy to summon up any kind of feeling for anybody. You're just drained. There's nothing there. You don't care about others. Your heart gets small and hard and cold. You turn inward. And what makes it even worse is that we don't even know what to do about it. Our tanks are empty, but we don't know how to put gas back in. The good news is that God does. And that's what we're going to see and learn from Elijah today. He was just a case study in emotional depletion, and the prescription that God wrote out for him is as needed for us today as it was for Elijah then. And it was actually 3 prescriptions that he wrote out. He needed all 3. So here was the first one. As he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came again and touched him and said, "Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. What was the first thing God did? He took care of him physically. God sends an angel to just give him a meal. The first thing God did to address the emotional exhaustion was to address the physical exhaustion that helped bring about the emotional exhaustion. Elijah needed to sleep and to eat and to rest. And did you notice the compassion in the angel God sent when he said, "The journey is just too much for you"? That wasn't a critique. It was sympathy. It was tenderness. It was compassion. It was understanding. We have a God who knows when the journey has been too much for us. A God who knows what we're going through and how we're feeling and where we're being and feeling overwhelmed. And the first thing God would say to you when you are at the end of whatever run you have in you is that he understands, he cares, and he wants you to stop running and to rest. God knew Elijah was tired and hungry, so what did he do? He fed him and he put him to bed. And when Elijah got up, God fed him and put him to bed again. Did you ever think that that might be God's prescription for you? And that because it is God's prescription for you, it's legal for you to pursue. Do you know how many people that I have come across over the years who feel guilty when they rest? Are you one of those? Guilty when you take a break, as if it's weakness or you're letting God down or you're letting somebody else down. Or I remember reading a book by Dr. Martin Moore-Eid called The 24-Hour Society, in which he describes a society that never sleeps and never rests and never quits and never stops. And then he says this about how in all of his studies and research, he found that the problem is that we're not built for the world that we have made, because the world we have made ignores the law of our limits. We need our rest. We need our sleep. And if we don't get it, our bodies will break down and then our emotions will follow. And that's not, and of course, that's not the only way that we need to care for ourselves physically. I mean, some of us need rest and more sleep. Sure, others of us just need to care for ourselves physically by getting out and exercising more or losing weight or just, there's 1,000 things related to our bodies, all kinds of physical prescriptions. But understand, caring for ourselves physically is the very first thing on God's list when it comes to caring for ourselves emotionally. So here's the second prescription. "Go out and stand before me on the mountain," the Lord told him. And as Elijah stood there, the Lord passed by, and a mighty windstorm hit the mountain. It was such a terrible blast that the rocks were torn loose, but the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was the sound of a gentle whisper, and Elijah heard it. In his depressed, discouraged, depleted condition, God showed Elijah exactly where to find him. It wasn't in the activity. It wasn't in all of his efforts. God said to Elijah, you're going to find me, and you're going to hear me in the quiet and in the stillness. And Elijah, you have not been going there very much of late, and you're wondering why you're feeling this way. When was the last time you were alone and quiet and just spent time listening to the voice of God and listening for the voice of God? Time that really allowed you to pray and to be reflective and to listen to the whisper of his voice. This matters because he's not found in the wind or the earthquakes or the fire, much less the noise and busyness, activity, and speed of our lives. He's not found in the busyness of all that we're doing to try and cope with life. He's not found decluttering your house or tackling another home improvement project or shuttling your kids back and forth to activities or working out or living online or taking that flight or going onto that trip. He's found in the stillness and the quiet and the whisper, in the silent movement of the Spirit over the waters of your soul. One of my favorite stories about this comes from the colonial history of Africa. A traveler took a long journey where he had recruited some local tribesmen to assist him in carrying his loads, and he arranged and worked out a payment for that they had requested, and that they bartered back and forth and came to an agreement. The first day they moved fast and they traveled far, and it was a great day, and they were way ahead of schedule, and he was real encouraged. On the second day he got up, but the tribesmen refused to move. They just sat and rested. The traveler, who wanted to get on with his journey, just kind of asked him, said, well, why can't we keep going? Why aren't you going? I mean, I don't understand. And here's what they told him. They said they had gone too fast on the first day, and now they were waiting for their souls to catch up with their bodies. Isn't that a wonderful way to phrase it? Waiting for their souls to catch up with their bodies. And that is what God would say to a lot of us. You need to let your soul catch up with your body, and that takes time. It does. Because here's something that very few people realize, unless you've gone through this cycle a few times of emotional depletion and emotional recharge and such. You can drain your emotional tank quickly, but filling it is another matter. I mean, you can fill your tank quickly, but that usually leads to even more burnout, and it's seldom done in a way that's healthy. I've heard it likened to like a car battery. If you take a car battery, take a car and you turn on its lights and its air conditioning, its radio, and every other electrical device available, and then turn the starter over, but without cranking it up, I mean, your battery will be dead in what, minutes? Now, there's two ways to get that car's battery charged up and ready to go. The first is known as a quick charge. A quick charge gets the battery up and running, no doubt, in a short amount of time, but if you do that too much, you will burn out the plates of your battery. So what's the best way? It's called a trickle charge. A trickle charge puts the energy back in slowly over time. Usually takes 6, maybe 8 hours, usually done overnight. It puts the energy back in slowly to avoid burnout. Now, your life, my life, is no different. I mean, you can try and quick charge by, diving into porn or an affair or binge drinking or drugs or eating or online games, but that's not best. And we know it. And we know it. What's best is to trickle charge, which means a life that takes regular God-centered Sabbaths. Something a lot of people don't take and usually misunderstand. What's a Sabbath? I mean, I know that I've heard the term, but what is it? It's actually one of the 10 Commandments, even. That's how serious it is. Let me just read where that shows up in the 10 Commandments. It says, remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. Now, let's unpack that. The word Sabbath doesn't mean Sunday, and it doesn't mean Saturday. It doesn't mean even a worship service. The word Sabbath literally means to cease, to stop, to quit, to rest. The Sabbath was originally on Saturday, and that is still the case in the practice for Jews. When Christianity began to spread, there was a movement toward having Sunday be the Sabbath because that was the day Jesus was resurrected. And that has been the tradition and practice for Christians for over 2,000 years. But which day of the week you use for the Sabbath isn't as important as setting aside a day of the week to have a Sabbath. For me, it's not a Saturday or a Sunday. Rumor has it I'm a little busy on weekends. For me, it's Friday. But the key is to make the day holy. And holy means something different, set apart, unique, unlike anything else. Something that is not like other things, or in this case, that is not like other times. Which means during that time, don't hurry. Don't do normal work. Don't do labor. Don't fill it with your regular schedule and daily activities, but instead let God flow into you. Focus on God. Let God flow into you in every way possible. That's why people have gathered for worship and teaching and interaction with others at least one day of the week, and they've usually made that, which makes sense, as a part of their Sabbath from day one. But it's not just about a time for a spiritual shot in the arm. It's also a time for an emotional one. In other words, you are to rest and you are to renew, which means do something on that day that puts gas in your tank. This is where people get the most confused about the Sabbath. It's not just about the absence of work or hurry, but the presence of that which fills you. If it's sailing, sail. If it's golfing, golf. If it's jogging, walking, playing tennis, reading, sewing, gardening, biking, do it. I love how one author described it. He said, eat foods you love to eat. Listen to music that moves your soul. Play a sport that stretches and challenges you. Read books that refresh your spirit. Wear clothes that make you happy. Surround yourself with beauty. And as you do these things, give thanks to God for his wonderful goodness. That's a Sabbath. And you need one dangerously close to every 7 days. It's called trickle charging. So, first, God addressed Elijah's physical condition, tended to him, fed him, told him to rest. Then God spoke to his spiritual condition and said, you need to quiet yourself. And this is where you're going to find me, in the quiet. That's where you're going to hear me and connect with me and draw from me. And you need to let your soul catch up in the process. There's still one more thing God wanted to do for this very emotionally depleted man. He had one more prescription to write. Then the Lord told him, go back the same way you came and travel to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive there, anoint Hazael to be king of Aram. Then anoint Jehu to be king of Israel, and anoint Elisha to replace you as my prophet. Now, do you see what God did there? He was telling Elijah that he needed to put in place people who would support him, protect him, encourage him, including a successor who he could mentor and pass the prophetic torch to, someone who would stand with him as a prophet. You know, one of the things that had drained Elijah emotionally is that he was doing life alone. Really, you study his life, and he was alone in almost everything he did. The only prophet of God left in Israel. He had no support, no encouragement, no one to stand by his side or watch his back. So what did God do? He told Elijah to invite some people into his relational orbit, people who would join with him, help him, stand with him. And God would say the exact same thing to you. Who are you letting into your life right now to help you do life? Are you even seeking anybody out? Is this even something that's on your radar? Trying to build those kinds of relationships where you spend time with them and you walk away feeling renewed and encouraged and closer to Christ? Or are you one of those people who would say, you don't need anybody, almost as a point of personal pride? Well, that's not a sign of strength. That's a sign that you're a train wreck, ready to happen. You know, we all just play best on a team. So again, let me ask you, do you have a spiritual friend? Someone who is following Christ, who will encourage you to keep following Christ? Do you have a mentor in your life? Do you have someone you can talk to who will pray with you and will try to serve you? Do you feel like you're on a team and have people who are doing life with you? See, God wants you surrounded, because sometimes what we need most are, again, people to do life with us. People who will walk with us and talk with us and listen to us and put their arms around us and pray for us. That's what God told Elijah he needed. And did you notice the specificity? God knew Elijah needed people. He also knew that Elijah didn't even know who those people needed to be. God had to tell him. You may not either. That's another beautiful thing about this. God knew exactly who he wanted to be in Elijah's life. And we need God's counsel for this, because we also need to address who we shouldn't have surrounding us. You may have right now surrounded yourself with people who are not helping you, who are actually hurting you with their attitudes and their spirits and their lack of spiritual maturity. So if you spend time with someone and you walk away from that time and you're more of a mess than you were before, you're more agitated, more ill at ease, more emotionally drained, more questioning of all things God, or more doubtful of your spiritual life, that person is not helping you. So God didn't just tell Elijah to get some people in his life. He told them who. He wanted some racehorses in his life. They were people who would protect him, help him, be on his side, and most importantly, these were people who were clearly on God's side. I really do believe, to the core of my being, just reading through Scripture, that God has a list of people in mind for you too. You just haven't prayed for him to reveal them to you, or maybe you just have never opened yourself up to relationships like that. But he's got a list of names. Well, right now, I have no doubt that, the journey is too much for a lot of us, a lot of you. We're tapped out. We're emotionally spent. And whenever I feel that way in my life, and I don't know about you, but I will confess, I can almost always point to one of three things. I wasn't taking care of myself physically. I wasn't spending quality time with God, or I wasn't surrounding myself with the right people, or I was surrounding myself with the wrong people. Sometimes I was doing all three. God has 3 prescriptions for us. He's got 3 prescriptions for you. Rest. Be still and listen for his voice. Let your soul catch up. And third, surround yourself with people who will help you get through this. All right. Well, let me pray for you to that end, can I? Father, I do pray for these 3 prescriptions, and we all need them at one time or another in our life. But right now, I pray for those who need rest, that they would rest. You would actually say, as God of the universe, let me just feed you and put you to bed. Many of us need to get out of the whirlwind and the fire and the earthquakes and find quiet so we can hear you, because that's where you're found. And Father, we all need to do relational inventories. Who is affecting us, and how are they affecting us? And who do we need in our life affecting us that we may not have now? So in these prescriptions are personal evaluations that we need to make. I hope we will. I hope we will, because emotional depletion is real for all of us, even for someone like Elijah. How much more will we need to listen to what you would say to us about it? I pray all that in the name of Jesus. Amen.